I know there was another person that I sent a link to as well. Okay, Makupa gave her background earlier. I don't know whether you want to amplify that. In any event, she's about to talk to us about the Tax Justice Network Africa perspective. And I think it will be interesting because not to say one person's right or another person's wrong, but it's a different perspective probably than we just heard. So Makupa, go ahead and please lead off.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, so I think you're coming across. Great.
Great. My name is Mukupan Sendeluka, and I'm the Policy Officer for Tax and Extractives at Tax Justice Network Africa. And yeah, happy to be here. I lead the work around tax and everything to do with mining, oil and gas. And yeah, this will be a slightly different perspective in the sense that it's really looking at things from a justice kind of view. And perhaps a number of you have already interacted a lot with the justice movements and some of the perspectives that we share. I did pick out that there were a lot of people who are from academia, a few from civil society and other organizations. So it's a pleasure to be here. So it's going to be a very, very open discussion. And if anyone has any questions or feels the need to stop me, please just do so. But I'll prefer to cruise through and then we can have a discussion afterwards. So yeah, so maybe just as a way to start off in terms of who we are as Tax Justice Network Africa, we are a Pan-African research and advocacy organization that was established in 2007 and a member of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And our secretariat is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And through our secretariat, we collaborate closely with different member organizations across the continent. As you can see from the map there, those are some of the countries where we work. And in each of those countries, we have at least one or two network partners who we collaborate because we believe that national organizations should lead their processes. So we work with those to push the tax justice agenda. And basically in our work, we advocate for pro-poor tax policies and the strengthening of tax systems to promote domestic resource mobilization. We believe that African states can become capable to mobilize resources to finance their own development so that then they're able to address the poverty and inequality challenges. So that's basically who we are as Tax Justice Network Africa. This is how my presentation will flow. There'll be an introduction. We'll go into a few issues related to illicit financial flows in Africa's extractive sector, challenges relating to taxing Africa's extractive sector, and then some emerging issues that have prompted the rethink to taxing extractives, and then some of the key policy demands and asks that we as a movement have been pushing for. So a lot of the things I'll say, it's framed really from the work that we've been doing with our network partners across the continent. Now, maybe just as a way to start off, why really does taxation of the EI sector matter for Africa? As you all know, I think most of us in the room here are very familiar with the contribution that the extractive sector has to taxation. But the first is that the EI sector is a dominant export earner on the continent. And so because it's a major activity, a number of our trade activities are hinged on the sector. And statistics indicate that in 2019, the extractive sector accounted for about a third of the exports that were the continent engaged in, of at least 60 countries. And then in terms of, I was hearing someone trying to speak. Okay, I continue. And in terms of how many countries are resource dependent, 42 out of 54 African countries are classified as resource dependent. So it's quite clear that the extractive sector is a key sector in terms of how we depend on it economically. And then the sector also contributes significantly to the amount of fiscal revenues, foreign currency reserves, and as well as employment opportunities. So for us as the Tax Justice Network movement, the EI sector really presents a good opportunity for domestic resource mobilization and the chance for Africa really to mobilize resources for its development. Okay, so in terms of statistics, just very briefly, that's data that I got from the 2021 EITI report, just showing mining sector contribution to tax revenues. You can see the DRC there has about, I'd say 34% of its mining revenues contributing to the treasury. We have a country like Zambia, where I'm from. I forgot to mention that. I'm based in Lusaka, Zambia. And as you know, we are a copper mining country, the second largest producer of copper in Africa, at about 27% of our revenue comes from the mining sector. So you can see, as you start off from countries that are highly dependent to countries that are not so dependent, the key role that the mining sector plays, for example, in some of these countries, and we'll speak a little more to countries like the DRC when you look at development financing and the extractive sector. Nigeria, moving on to an oil and gas country. Nigeria is one of the 12 largest producers of oil and gas globally, and largest in Africa. 9% of the country's GDP comes from the oil and gas sector, and then about 65% of the revenue from the oil and gas sector contributes to government revenue. And then in terms of exports, it's about 85%. So again, Nigeria is one of those countries that is known to be heavily resource dependent, particularly on the oil and gas sector. Again, there is just another map confirming this. You can look at that depiction. In terms of oil, we see that almost half of the revenues earned come from oil, and then the non-oil is about 52%. So in the 52%, you have your agriculture, you have your manufacturing and other key sectors. So this is again really depicting the resource dependency of the continent. So for us as a movement, I think the key thing that we focus on is, are these resources working for the people? Are these resources generating the revenue that they should be generating? And I think in a number of countries, you agree with me on the continent that the paradox of plenty is at play. So just there depicting a case of Nigeria, which is the largest producer of oil on the continent. And yet these are some of the schools that the children in Nigeria have to sit in. So the question then again comes, are these extractive projects really working for the African people? Another depiction there is the DRC, which has about 70% of the world's reserves and a top producer of copper. But again, the Global Hunger Index of 2021 classifies the DRC as the world's fifth hungriest country. And so again, very evident that these resources are not working for us. The multinational companies that are engaging in our countries are engaged in a number of vices that we'll speak about that are relating to why some of our revenues are being undermined in terms of collection. So in terms of education financing, I found this depiction very interesting. Just looking at this is a report that was done by UNESCO about 9-10 years ago, depicting education financing in resource-rich countries. And I'll particularly highlight the DRC. So in the DRC, when you look at the minus section here, it shows us that at the time, about 9% of their budget was being channeled to education financing. Now, what this study was trying to show was if countries like the DRC dealt with their tax revenue challenges from the extractive sector, how much more would they be able to collect to address the education financing gaps? And what was found in the DRC was that an extra $223 million would be collected if the DRC dealt with its governance and tax collection challenges, and 3,620 more children would be able to attain an education. And so you can see that indeed the paradox of plenty is very prominent in countries like the DRC, which is heavily resource rich. But then again, when you look at the education financing gap, they're struggling to meet it, as can be seen from those statistics. And again, this is just another depiction showing that kids that should be in school in the DRC are digging out cobalts for phones that they'll never be able to use, like iPhones. So again, we've heard of so many labor rights concerns when it comes to children in the DRC. We've heard of how they're exploited for cobalt mining in the DRC, and yet these are phones that end up in fancy places in the Western world, and things that, because they're not in school, they will never be able to enjoy. So again, it begs the question, what really is the cost for these mining activities in our countries if we are not able to mobilize the required resources needed, for example, for education financing? Now, speaking a little bit to the presentation, touching a bit on some of the issues that was given by our colleagues earlier on, I think, which was a very interesting presentation. It's always good to hear an alternative perspective. Again, when it comes to the complexities of taxing the extractive sector in Africa, and I think our colleagues earlier alluded to it, that it can be complex. So it's like trying to pluck feathers from a goose without it hissing, right? And is that possible? A chicken. So you get a chicken, you're trying to put the feathers and ensuring that it's calm. So basically showing that taxation is complex and navigating it can sometimes be challenging for both governments and companies. And then, of course, hike the taxes and the investors get angry and threaten to leave the country, destroy job opportunities, which then affects trade opportunities as well as local supply contracts. And I've seen this, for example, in my country about 5 years ago, where the former government was trying to navigate the changes in the fiscal regime, which I'll refer to later on, that managing these interests was a challenge. And so sometimes they would make these unilateral decisions which would then discourage investors from investing more in the sector. But at the same time, ensuring that, so at that time, the key question then became, how do we manage the interests? And I'll highlight this a little further later on. Again, investors leave the country, we end up with no resources. This again is debatable, because again, the question is, if we had to put down our foot and say the investors should leave the country, would they really leave? These are things that we debate on in civil society. So again, just highlighting that it's not a straight forward issue, and governments and companies, particularly governments, have the challenge to navigate this so that you sort of have a win-win situation. But at the end of the day, again, governments have the mandate to ensure that extractive projects work for the people. So what policies then are they putting in place to ensure that they mobilize the most from these resources to finance development? Again, we've seen the new trend in terms of corporate pressure, the social license to operate, that companies now are being put under pressure by investors to do investment the right way. And when you go to these communities, sometimes you find that there's a huge disconnect between where the companies are headquartered in the West versus where the extraction is happening. And I think these are things that we've seen in most countries. In my country, for example, we've been mining for 100 years here in Zambia. And yet when you go to communities, it's a sad story because there's nothing meaningful to show for the development. Now, getting into the IFF's discussion, which I think a number of us are familiar with here, getting just into the numbers, a more recent report in 2020 revealed that about 89 billion is lost through illicit financial flows in Africa. And of that 89, about 40 United States billion dollars comes from the extractive sector, the export of primary extractive resources on the continent. So that's almost about slightly over 2/3 of that. So we see that this is indeed a big challenge, and we'll be speaking a little more to that. Why we fail to get the most from our extractive projects is the challenge of illicit financial flows, and the numbers have given us a picture of that. And these IFFs are concentrated in high value, low weight commodities such as gold, diamonds, and other precious metals. And of the estimated 40 billion, the report reveals about 77% of that was in the gold supply chain, and then 12% in diamonds and 6% in platinum. So we see that those minerals that are easy to smuggle, low weight, are the ones that are most susceptible to the illicit financial flows. A more recent report from the IMF again confirms the stats that about 470 million to about 730 million per year is lost in corporate tax avoidance by from the mining sector by multinationals engaging in corporate tax avoidance. Again, really highlighting the challenge that this IFF's issue is a big deal in the extractive sector. And again, for us from a tax justice movement, the issue is that these represent numbers. All those figures we've spoken about, the 40 billion, the 430, the 730 million dollars represents the schools and hospitals that could have been built on the continent to address our poverty and inequality challenges. I zoned in on the case of the DRC, just because the DRC is one of those countries that is resource rich and yet has nothing to show for it. In 2013, for example, the DRC lost about 430 million in revenues through IFFs. Sorry, I can hear someone speaking. Maybe if you can mute, I'm not sure who it is. Thank you, please. Thank you for that. So about 430 was lost through IFFs and corruption, and the larger, this could have gone into financing 7.2 million children in a primary school, as this was larger than their entire education budget. So this amount was at least 2 times larger than the education financing budget. So for us, again, the DRM question comes into play. If you're all familiar with the 2021, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the 2021 State of Tax Justice Network report, which reveals, again, this is a more recent report with more recent data, just showing how much the DRC lost through corporate tax abuse. And for me, the figure speaks it all, because when you look at corporate tax abuse and the extractive sectors, we've seen that a lot of the IFF's activities happen as a result of the dominance of extractive sector activities. You will notice that this then correlates with the activities in DRC, and about 638 million was lost in 2021. Now, when you break down the 638 million, the report reveals that this could have vaccinated a total of 37 million people against COVID-19, which is about 47 million of the population, and could have gone into financing 303% of the health budget, basically saying that if that money wasn't lost through corporate tax avoidance, that money would have essentially dealt with all the budget needs for 2021 in the DRC. And again, if you redistributed that amount, 638 million, each of the members or the citizens in the DRC would get at least $8 in a population of 79 million. So again, really just highlighting that the problem of IFFs is serious, and again, dealing with it, especially in the extractive sector in countries like the DRC, becomes key. Now, what are some of the things that we've noticed through the work that we do across the continent? These are not all the challenges. I'll just speak to some of them, obviously, due to constraints of time. I think in terms of speaking to the challenges that come with taxing the extractives.
Makupa, let me just stop you for a brief minute. Apparently, some people are having trouble hearing the lecture. I don't know whether how many people are having trouble hearing things? If you could raise your hand. I know one person is, because there's a message in the chat box. Anybody else? Okay, I don't see it.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Slow up just a little bit. Maybe that will.
Okay. Sorry for that.
That's
maybe
right.
I'm too fast. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. So yeah, in terms of taxing the extractives, a key challenge that we noticed, as we all know, I think, is the dominance of foreign multinationals operating in the sector. And these multinationals are involved in the activities from exploration to production, making the sector prone to corporate tax abuse. And for example, at exploration stage, we've noticed that in terms of some of the things that have come up, is issues of cost inflation, falsifying declarations, and also the bribing of government officials. Now, when we manipulate costs, this obviously leads to the profits being manipulated and therefore companies declaring losses. So the issue which deals with the dominance of foreign multinational companies is really a challenge. And I think it speaks to some of the things that were said earlier around governments now going the state-owned enterprise route, because they're saying we've lost out for so long by having more multinationals dominating the sector. Perhaps we could try the state-owned model where we ourselves are controlling the assets. That again has a whole debate around capacity, around legacy issues from the past when governments, for example, like in Zambia, were in charge of the mines and they were run down into losses. But again, this is the stage where we are at in terms of navigating the extractive sector. Another challenge is sometimes governments have unrealistic expectations and a limited understanding of the long-term nature of the mining, oil and gas sector for profit realization. So you find that most times governments will overpromise the people that once this mining project comes, you have jobs, you have shopping malls, you have roads, and get everybody excited, but without fully understanding or conducting feasibility studies to ascertain when these benefits will be realized and what really it will take for the benefits to be realized. So sometimes some of these governments and realistic expectations then put them in a compromising situation, because now citizens start to demand for these things when the company is declaring losses. Inadequate geological information to knowing the true value of our minerals is another challenge. So I think the big challenge, again, we see across the continent is that most geological departments don't know how much of the minerals they have within the ground, right? So because these departments are often underfunded and a lot of money is not allocated to investing in human capital and the knowledge to conduct some of this research, we have the challenge of inadequate geological information, which then affects us knowing how much worth of copper, for example, is in the ground to be able to determine the right fiscal regime that would be ideal for that resource. So again, you cannot tax what you adequately don't know. So a number of times, the governments in Africa have to rely on, for example, a company like Glencore coming with its expertise, telling them, here you have so much copper or cobalt, and then the governments have to work with that, which really compromises on them knowing the truth of the matter in terms of the value of the resource. Poorly designed and negotiated fiscal terms of mining, oil and gas contracts, which have overly generous tax incentives locked in fiscal stabilization clauses. And I heard you ask this, John, to the previous speakers. I think this is a challenge that is faced across the continent, and I won't get much into it because I know other speakers in the coming days will. But really, from a top line level, this is something that most African governments grapple with because they're desperate to get the investment in. And we have seen research confirm that tax incentives in the extractive sector don't necessarily promote FDI. And so when you have a company coming to invest in your country, beyond the tax incentives, they're looking at the quality of the infrastructure, labor issues, and other things. So again, the question of why we get into these deals then is something that we need to address as a continent. Very quickly, again, over-reliance on profit-based taxes. Again, we've spoken about how corporate tax abuse happens and undermines DRM. Again, the issue of inadequate administrative capacity to actually address this issue of corporate tax abuse is something that we face. Of course, we've seen governments make progress in terms of building the capacity of their revenue authorities. But again, the challenge of capacity remains. And again, we see that governments don't put enough investments, for example, in armoring their revenue authorities with the right information and knowledge. So that again continues to exacerbate the problem, and we have issues related to base erosion and profit shifting. Price volatility again is another thing, something perhaps that is external to us and we can't control. So with this challenge, for example, we saw it during the COVID-19 crisis where we saw oil prices take a hit, but we also saw gold prices go up. So again, these are factors, again, if you the question of what system you have as a country
Hello.
comes into play. Because if you have a progressive
Yes, how is
system,
that?
you'll be
I'm
able
okay.
to,
This
sorry,
with
I'm not sure
the
who's speaking.
Ochamo, Mark's office.
If you're not speaking, you have to put
John,
your
I think
phone
it's
on mute.
John who's speaking. Please kindly mute. I'm almost done. Yeah. So this is something that again comes into play when dealing with issues of taxation, because sometimes we don't have control over the external factors when it comes to price volatility of commodities. Policy inconsistencies. This is something we've seen, for example, in Zambia, where the mining fiscal regime changed at least 10 times in 15 years. And this is because governments were responding to quick short-term shocks in the environment, but also political reasons we're backing some of these decisions. So you find that governments sometimes, because they have political interests or because perhaps there's something we don't know behind the scenes, they change the fiscal regime, and this then undermines its effective DRM. A success story we can learn from is in Norway, where I think both political parties agreed, both the opposition and the ruling party agreed that whichever government comes into play, they would not change the fiscal regime because it affects investment in the sector. And so they've had a stable regime for a long time. And this is something I think perhaps governments in Africa need to agree, because what tends to happen is that when a government is elected out of power, the new government that comes then starts to tamper with the policy, and that affects how investors respond. The issue of contract transparency, I think I won't get into this, but opacity and secrecy in the deal signing processes has undermined how we govern the sector and effectively get what we need to get from it. So the no transparency and accountability on the agreed fiscal terms to the public is often a big issue that we deal with. So in view of those challenges, there are new emerging issues for why we need to rethink taxation in Africa. And some of these emerging issues present us with opportunities. So the issue of climate change brings about the issue of the energy transition, where we need to move from what they're terming dirty sources of energy to cleaner sources of energy. And we see that the energy transition brings with it both new risks and opportunities. One, for example, of the risks is for oil extraction and coal producing countries like South Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria. So for us, again, in the work that we are doing around tax and climate justice, is asking the question, what are policymakers doing to prepare for this? So if you look at Nigeria, like we saw, it's heavily reliant on oil extraction. What happens now that there's this new dispensation of the energy transition? Should Africa even transition? And I know there's a whole debate around energy poverty, which we won't get into, but I think from a tax justice perspective is, if Nigeria has not diversified its portfolio of investments or development revenue streams, what happens now when oil prices take a hit due to the transition? Something for African governments to think about. Revenue opportunities, again, for low carbon minerals like copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel. We have countries like DRC, Zambia, and Tanzania looking to benefit from the transition. So the issue then becomes, how are governments preparing for... Someone is speaking again. I don't know if it's John Okira. Please kindly mute. Yes. So these are the revenue opportunities before us. So what then should African governments do? And what should citizens like ourselves be doing to be questioning our governments to be ready for what lies ahead? Another emerging issue is the issue of resource-backed loans, where governments are putting their resources as a guarantee for debt repayment. And I think this is evident where we see a lot of governments fiscally constrained, right? They're already in debt distress. They need more resources to finance their developments. Things like the COVID-19 pandemic are exacerbating the situation. And now there's this talk of a transition. So governments are grappling with the issue of debt, and then having to put forward their resources, which haven't been extracted, as a guarantee to pay back their debt, or as a guarantee itself. So I think for us as a civil society movement is really asking the question of, if you are using your future wealth, which is the resource in the ground, as guarantee of past debt, is there really hope for the extractive industry in Africa? And we've seen, for example, in South Sudan, where a bridge, most governments get this to finance infrastructure projects. So we saw a short bridge built in South Sudan backed against future oil revenues. So that's another trend that has been emerging and something for civil society as well as governments to think through for the future. Automation of the extractive sector is another key thing where we are seeing more companies moving to using robots and other technologies, and what this will mean for jobs. So if you have lesser jobs, it means you have lesser payroll taxes, which means a larger share of government revenue. So again, these are things that are coming in the new dispensation of the energy transition, and something that we are saying to ourselves, what should African governments do to prepare for this? But also citizens need to be aware of these things to hold their governments accountable. The increasing role of China is another thing, especially when it comes to even the energy transition. China is one of those countries that has the most reserves when you look at the low carbon minerals like your copper, your lithium. So what will it mean when we have China taking lead in this space when it comes to transparency concerns, given the way we know China does business? So some of our key policy asks in view of some of the challenges and the emerging issues we've been putting forward with governments that we work with, and I'll speak a little bit to that in a short while, is really the need for African governments to design more progressive tax policies and laws for them to leverage the revenues from the extractive sector. And by progressive, we mean this is a regime that should be cognizant of the external changes, should take into view the needs of the locals, especially the development financing needs, but also ensuring that investors also get their fair share. And that's, I think, a space that is difficult to navigate. But this is what we are calling for. And we've been working with parliamentarians, for example, I'll give an example of Liberia, where we supported a group of parliamentarians through the work that we've been doing to reject a bad mining deal with ArcelorMittal, which was going to disadvantage them hugely due to some of the provisions in the tax incentives clauses. So as a movement, we are saying parliamentarians are the ones that are in these mining committees. They should have the information. They're the ones signing the deals and giving approvals and oversight. And so we should capacity build them so that when they're seated in those low policy making spaces, they're able to ask the critical right questions even before signing mining agreements. Another key issue is local content. So much was said before, but I think for us as a movement is ensuring that how do we make mining work for the African people? And how do we ensure that mining becomes so integrated into the local economies? Because what happens is we see that mining is so externalized. You have a community with no linkages happening with the activities on the ground. So for us, we believe that local content and economic diversification can be achieved. And what governments need to do is to domesticate frameworks like the Africa Mining Vision. I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with this framework, but this, I think, is the perfect starting point. If we are to talk about localization of mining, if we are to talk about benefits for mining and beneficiation, the Africa Mining Vision proposes a transformational broad-based approach to mining in Africa. And there's a whole lot of provisions on how we can do local content better, on how we can have more procurement opportunities, even beyond jobs. The value addition question, again, is a big issue. And some of the things that we've been proposing is that we need to move away from just pushing to taxing raw materials to actually taxing goods that add value, that have value addition added to them in order to curb this issue of IFFs, and also be able to trade with an equal voice on the international market. Because once we are able to add value to our products, it means we can also trade in a fairer manner. Botswana, again, is a good example of what can be done well when you have a mechanism in the law that ring fences financing from the extractive sector to specific sectors like education, health, and infrastructure. It's not only Botswana, we also have countries like Ghana that have put in place a mechanism in their law to ensure that whenever they collect their revenues from the extractive sector, a specific percentage is channeled to key human development sectors like education, health, and social protection. And we've also seen over time how Botswana has consistently spent at least over 5% of its GNP towards education since the 1970s. And this has put Botswana on the map, even in terms of being one of those countries in sub-Saharan Africa that is doing fairly well economically because it's invested in its education. So that there is a mechanism and a solution that African governments can start to think about going forward, even with the extractive sector. Governments should stop awarding overly generous and targeted tax incentives to mining company. And I think here what our big ask is, could proper cost-benefit analysis be done of some of these incentives that are awarded? If you are giving away so much in incentives, how much then is going to come through as a result of those investments? And there we have a picture showing a government official awarding tax incentives and saying there is no money for education. Again, I spoke to this earlier. I think the issue of research, we've seen research from the IMF as well as IGF saying tax incentives don't necessarily promote FDI in the extractives, that other things like political instability, infrastructure, labor, dispute resolution issues matter more. So why then are African governments giving these incentives? So these are things that we need to be aware of. And these are things that we as a movement have been pushing forward from a tax justice lens. Local content, again, I think I spoke to this already, that beyond taxation, I think we need to push for mining that really is integrated in the local economy. And Chile, I think, has a good model around this. There's so many lessons to learn from a country like Chile with the copper mining sector, that there should be ripple effects even beyond mining. So the banking sector, insurance, freight, warehousing, security, and processing, these are all sectors that could be birthed as a result of mining. And so governments need to be intentional about some of these linkages that have to be made even as an investment is starting in an area. Transparency and accountability remains the big issue. I think if contracts are made public, if contracts are put out there for scrutiny and citizens have the right information to ask the right questions, as well as parliamentarians, we can then ensure that we get into better deals from the industry. Beneficial ownership disclosure, again, the issue of who truly owns these mines, because we see that a number of these illicit activities thrive in secrecy, and in this secrecy, we don't know who the real owners are. So again, pushing for beneficial ownership disclosure is something that we've been doing in our work, as well as for frameworks like the EITI, implementation of frameworks like the EITI, which push for transparency and accountability. Just very quickly, in a few minutes, looking into some of the work and our campaigns. So we are involved in a lot of global campaigning at national level, regional level, as well as global level. And really through our campaigning work, we are saying we need an international financial architecture that works for African countries, because African countries most often times are not seated at those global tax policy making processes and are therefore excluded from voicing out their concerns. So what we are demanding is that we need an international financial system or tax system that works so that we can be able to see multinationals pay their fair share of taxes, even in the extractive sector. And just looking very briefly, even in our work, we work with parliamentarians, we work with CSOs, the media, and different actors to do this campaigning work at the different levels that I've highlighted. And you'll be familiar, maybe some of you will be familiar with a campaign called the Stop the Bleeding, the campaign, which we launched in 2015, basically pushing for the curbing of illicit financial flow through the transformation of the international financial architecture. And to date, we've had about 5,622 signatures. So lastly, I'll end on this slide. This is basically a slide that of a campaign that we are involved in now, where we are calling for a UN tax body, because at the moment, tax policy decision-making is done by a few group of countries, under the OECD framework. Of course, there's the element of the inclusive framework, but what we are saying is that in addition to the G7 and G20 countries, we would like more African countries to be part of that process. And this really is calling for a UN tax body, moving the decision-making processes on taxes to a UN process, which is more representative as opposed to an OECD-led process, which excludes a number of African countries. So this is one of our latest campaigns. And if you come across it, please do sign on, as we would like more signatures to push back against the global international financial architecture that is working against Africa. And lastly, our concern and our big ask is extractive resources are finite and non-renewable. And what will Africa as a continent have to show for it 100 years from now if we don't demand for change now? So this is why we work in the tax justice space, really, to ensure that we have a progressive tax system that works for Africa, but also particularly with the extractive sector, given the fact that these resources are finite and that they will run out at some point. We need to ensure that we collect our fair share of revenues now to finance our development for the benefit of the African people. So that's it from me. John, over to you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Makupa. Very interesting comments. We'd love to reform the world, no doubt. And what I'd like to do is open it up to people. I see one hand raised. I'm sure there are a lot more comments. I will say, the interesting question that's raised is what's the balance in moving things along toward a better system between companies and governments. In any event, Phoebe has her hand up, so let me start. Let's start with Phoebe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mukupa, for this great presentation. I've been doing work on illicit financial flows, and the presentation was spot on. So I have a few questions. One, I was wondering, does tax justice do work in Uganda? And if it does, I wanted to know which organization is responsible particularly, because I see you didn't have a lot of statistics from Uganda, so I was wondering. Then I was also wondering how we could get your presentation and also the report that you talked about, because it had lots of information that's related to our work. Then also when you are quoting EITI statistics, I was wondering why in particular Uganda didn't surface. I don't know. I was just wondering why Uganda doesn't come in a lot. Yeah, thank you so much.
There's a lot there.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe I can take one or two more and then respond.
Okay.
And any comments also will be valuable from the team about just the thoughts around this kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions there on the Uganda. So, but folks, other questions? There are a lot of provocative issues here, I think. So let's put a few questions on the table and then Makupa can respond to them.
Okay, there's a hand from Jacqueline Wahome.
Oh, okay.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Mukupa, for the great presentation. I joined a bit late, so I just got the last part of the previous presentation. But one thing you said in your presentation also rang a bell from the previous presentation, and that is about policy changes. You mentioned something about governments coming in with quick fixes or new regimes coming in and responding to pressure, perhaps informed by their campaigns and their manifestos. So the question is, as much as I am also part of civil society, as much as we keep pushing for policy changes to benefit communities more and host countries more, to what extent are those policy recommendations informed by the needs of the private sector as well? And once new policies come into place, do they have a negative impact in that they did not have a 360-degree view, so to speak? So we see new policies that perhaps end up bringing negative effects where they were supposed or they were envisioned to bring in positive impact. So what is the process in making sure that our policy recommendations are not causing harm?
Thanks, Jacqueline.
That's a good question. Do we have
Yes.
other, do you want to start by some comments, Makupa, or do you want to wait for other questions?
Okay. I think I can respond to those
Hello, sorry.
sentiments. So, yeah, maybe I can
Okay.
listen to learn more.
Thank you very much. I was raising my hand, so I was waiting for John to pick me. Anyway, it's okay.
I didn't see your hand, learn more. It's fine. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mukupa. I wish you could go on with your presentation. I wish you could add some more slides. I was enjoying your presentation. Like I told you, the first session was more of a private perspective. Now we've come to the civil society sort of view. And
Yes,
if you
yeah.
try to look at it, it seems as if like they are conflicting somehow. So of course there are some common areas. But my question is relating to issue of political will. You know, sometimes when I look in my country, sometimes I feel like we are fighting the government and the private sector. It seems as if we as citizens or civil society, we don't have much power in terms of influencing policy, in as much as we say a lot of things, do a lot of campaigns, but you would see that those propositions are being proposed by the private sector are taken into the budget or something else, but all the issues that will be raising a civil society are sort of like set aside. Maybe the reason might be because we have a situation where most of our politicians are rich people who are also involved in mining or are conniving or collaborating with these people to the extent that sometimes when they give these tax incentives to their benefit because they know they are partners somehow, whether directly or indirectly. So my question now, in short, is how do you see the issue of political will concerning the taxation of the extractive sector? I think it is known. What needs to be done is known. Unfortunately, it's not being implemented. What's your comment on that one? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that great question, and more. Okay. Maybe I'll start with the first one. My sister Phoebe from Uganda. So does tax justice work in Uganda? Yes. We work with our partner Siatini. They're one of our partners that we work with closely. And I think for Uganda, it's an interesting space now, I think, because of what you have going on around the oil and gas discoveries and the debate that's come with that. So we've been working with Siatini beyond extractives on issues related to tax and incentives, tax and investments, and even beneficial ownership work. And in terms of why I didn't use, so yes, we are in Uganda, and please do get in touch. I can put my contacts there so that we can see how we can connect you to them, and so that you can be involved in the work that we are doing there. They're doing some pretty exciting work on tax issues. In terms of the statistics, I think I picked, if you notice, it was focused on mining. I know mining, I could be wrong, but I know that the big thing in Uganda has been the issue of gold and linked to even the conflict minerals. But I picked data that the EITI report had publicly disclosed in that year. I didn't see Uganda, maybe I missed it, but there was no reason that I left Uganda. I think it was just focusing on those mining strongholds that I picked. But I think it would be interesting to see what the report does say on Uganda. And yes, I can share with you the State of Tax Justice report. This is done by, so we have Tax Justice Network Africa based here in Nairobi, and then we have the Tax Justice Network UK, where they deal more with they're also our allies, but they work more on the global issues. And so they produce this State of Tax Justice report annually, doing this very interesting analysis on how corporate tax abuse undermines revenue collection for development financing. So John, I can share that with you, maybe to distribute to the entire class, because it does these country cases beyond even the one I gave on the DRC. Jacqueline, sure. Very, very interesting question. I think policy making, first of all, the extractive sector is a highly political space. Even when you look at just from a global point of view, there's so many interests. I think it's the one sector where you have to manage the government, the community, and the corporates. So that in itself makes it a very, very extremely political space. And of course, we, the citizens, are looking to the government who we've entrusted to manage our resources on our behalf to make the right and good decisions for us. But more often than not, what we've seen in African context and even beyond is that the governments let us down. And I think this is where the challenge comes into play. So shoddy deals that are signed because people have interest, and I think, Lenmo, this also touches to your question. We know what needs to be done, but we don't do it. And in some cases, we have the perfect policies, but we don't implement them. So number one, it's a case of the issue of geological information that I spoke to, I think is very key. We know that if you invest in geological information, you'll be able to make more informed decisions of what contracts or what mining deals you enter into. But like in my country, the geological department is one of the most underfunded departments. And so we find ourselves entrusting investors coming into our countries with the data saying, here there's so much copper. Now, I always ask the guys at the mining department saying, do you think these companies will truly tell you the truth of how much copper is in your own country? Of course, they're going to say there's only 6 million tons and then start to mine it illegally and smuggle out more. So I think for me, in dealing with the question of how do we ensure policies that are well balanced, it's first to capacitate ourselves with the right information. Because of the huge information gaps, even beyond geological information to just understanding the sector, we fail most times to make decisions that are informed by research or data that is credible. And so when an investor comes, politicians get excited, there are all these opportunities to make money, and they give away our mining projects at a peanuts price. So the issue of knowledge is number one. Number two is this knowledge, not only in government, but also ensuring that we build movements that can hold our governments accountable. And I know, for example, in my country, we are at a stage where we feel like we've done all the trainings, we've done all the capacity building that we need to do. But again, it's the not giving up, because if we let our governments go, then it means we can't hold them accountable. So consistent capacity building with the government, consistent capacity building with parliamentarians. This example from the Liberia case was really something that moved us in our work, and we felt for the first time in a long time that the work that we do is actually adding value to change. I'll end with this in a minute. So we went to Liberia in March to conduct a training. It was just a normal training on taxation and domestic resource mobilization. And we did a presentation on tax incentives and some of the red flags that need to be looked out for with a group of parliamentarians. And when we left, we came back, we heard that 3 weeks later after the training, they had rejected the deal and sent it back to the executive using some of the things that we had walked them through. So I think, again, the issue of political will is something that remains key to this movement, that at the end of the day, even if you have all the technical knowledge, if the political will is not there, then we are not able to push for change and reform. So I would say we keep pushing until we get it right for tax justice in the extractive sector. I think, John, I'll end there. I feel like I've said too much. I don't know if there's someone else who has a comment.
Yeah, other people have questions or comments they'd like to make, whether your hand's raised or not. It's a good time to speak. You have to unmute yourself. So I don't know, Michael, did you have a question or comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation, and I think covers very well what topics have been most intensively debated over the last 10 years. One topic that's hard to sometimes come to grips with in the extractive sector is tax competition. On the one hand, we think that the extractive industries are a little bit less or are a bit less prone to tax competition than other industries because the investors have no alternative but to go where the resources are located. You can't threaten to move your investment to a part of the world where there are no resources. On the other hand, for I think almost every product, every category of product, the investors have more than one choice. And so tax competition is probably more significant in the extractive sector that is commonly recognized. And I'm wondering whether there might be a thought for, say, all copper producers or something like that, or some group like that, all iron producers, to agree that certain types of tax incentives would be out of balance. Kind of like, a standard anti-competitive agreement, really. But I think that from a normative standpoint, it's defensible for governments to do that. I mean, after all, the governments are selling, really basically are selling their irreplaceable resources, non-renewable resources. Are you aware of any instances in which extractive countries have tried to get together to limit the tax incentives they're willing to give in the course of tax competition?
That's a great question, Michael. I think the biggest challenge that we see through the work that we do is that I think African governments are not working together to harmonize the tax system. I think the EAC has tried. I think it's one of those EAC regional blocks that is the most united in terms of even trade and other economic agreements. But you're absolutely right. The issue of tax competition exacerbates the problem of the race to the bottom, which then, instead of looking at how can we as a continent progress, African governments and countries are looking at their own. So Zambia is there saying, I want to attract more FDI into my country. Rwanda is there saying, opening an international financial center, which will basically, zero rate taxes. So I think for me, the biggest challenge I see is the lack of harmonization and unity. And I think going forward, we need to get to a place where African governments can truly agree to say, this is the stand we'll take for extractive projects. So for example, now with the copper price boom and the energy transition, this is a great opportunity for African governments to say, this is the time to harmonize our tax policies and say no, for example, to opening of international financial centers like what Kenya and Rwanda are doing. So there needs to be more collaboration, there needs to be more coordination, and there needs to be more unity amongst African Union states to push back. And despite this being a global issue, I think African governments also need to unite a little more, and frameworks like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement provide a good starting point, right? Where if you are going to do trade as a bloc, it means you have to unite and harmonize a number of your tax policies and agree that even if Glencore comes into Tanzania and offers a lower rate, Tanzania will say no because it's not fitting in the benchmark. So that would be my comment on tax competition. I think going forward, we need more unity and we need more African political will for African governments to unite on this.
Yeah, I mean, there are comment on the chat box. As you know, there's a minimum tax proposal under Pillar 2 to impose a minimum tax around the world. And of course, that does away with, to the degree of the minimum tax rate, which is 15%, does away with tax competition. Some countries love it, other countries don't. So I will say in the contracts that I've seen, there's frequently a fiscal incentive, which is a tax holiday for 10 years. And, when you have those in contracts and they impose a minimum tax after the fact, so to speak, that effectively does away with that tax holiday. So I don't know whether you or others that there are a couple of people that commented on the chat box would like to speak to the minimum tax proposal. Is it a good idea, bad idea? It does away with tax competition to a degree, but it also takes away some sovereignty of countries.
I think from the few interactions I've had with it, and it would be great to hear from others on the call. I know there's a whole lot of experts, please. But maybe let's wait, let's hear from others, and then I can just give briefly what the TGNA has been doing around this. I can see Len Moore's hand. I don't know if you want to unmute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to give my view concerning the minimum tax. So I think it is pro and cons. Okay, for those African nations that are charging maybe less than 15%, I look at effective tax rate, not the statutory rate per se. It gonna solve, I mean, that problem of giving such incentive. Maybe the extreme case of charging maybe 0% to that extent. But however, if you look now generally in Africa, generally our CIT corporate income tax are very high to the extent that 15% may not be, I mean, sufficient enough or good enough to reduce tax competition. I would say we have a new situation where people will be competing, or countries will be competing to 15%, I would say. That's number one. Then number two, the other issue is that there are only about 21 to 23 countries that are part of the OECD inclusive framework. And what does that mean? Those who are not members of the inclusive framework, let's say that mutual agreement is signed and people decide to go ahead with that. It means once we don't tax, we are giving other sovereignty nations to tax that comment that we refuse to make just because they're not member of the inclusive framework. So I would say, yeah, it just mixed feelings. Whereas we feel like 15% is too low, but in as much as too low, if we don't cooperate, they are going to tax it for us. So in the end, it is the developed countries that will benefit out of this. Since from the beginning, the OECD, it was a G20 thing. Not like, that's why maybe the TGNA is calling for a UN tax body where everyone would equal opportunity, unlike where the agenda of few developed or what do I say, I mean, big countries are dominating. Thank you very much. These are my contributions.
Other people have commented on the minimum tax. It is coming from the OECD, which has tried to broaden the framework out to the inclusive framework. Any other comments on that?
I'd like to put Chennai on the spot if she's on. Chennai. My colleague Chennai, I'm not sure she's on. Chennai, are you able to give a comment on this?
I can.
Yes, thank you.
Not to put you on the spot, Chennai.
I mean, I feel like I think it was Linma who was speaking just now. And I think I agreed with a lot of what he was saying. I think particularly pertaining to the effectiveness of the global minimum tax. I think in principle, it's a great idea, and I think could help address the issue of tax competition on the continent. I just think there's been a lot of back and forth, right, amongst different stakeholders as to what that amount should be. And Linma mentioned if we have a corporate income tax rates of between 25 and 30% on the continent, you aren't really disincentivizing multinational corporations from shifting their profits, because there still is quite a gap between the two. But again, like Linmo said, it's the effective tax rate that we're looking at here. And so, each country therefore has different ways in which that they would look at it. But yeah, I think by and large, those would be my comments.
Thank you very much, Chennai.
Just an observation, if it's all right. Tax competition has been around for a very long time. And when you look at the standard kind of profit shifting done by industrial multinationals all around the world, including, of course, in Africa, it's really a problem of governments permitting insufficient compensation for things that happen in the developing countries. And we'll discuss tomorrow. It's basically a transfer pricing issue, an issue of being just as it often is in the extractive sector. This has been going on since the 1960s. And all countries in the world have had it within their power to stop the profit shifting through domestic legislation, through tighter transfer pricing rules or various restrictions on limitations on deductions outside the country. And no country has done it because of tax competition. And that raises the question of whether in some cases, the desire to stop this profit shifting, the desire to stop what are really implicit tax incentives by allowing this, how sincere it might be among some political groups, because you know, it's political leaders do get a lot of benefit, not only illicit benefit, but perfectly legitimate benefit from having foreign direct investment. And you know, I think that part of the solution to the problems of tax avoidance in extractive industries or in the tax profit shifting, tax avoidance generally, as is trying to be addressed by this the Pillar 2 tax, really requires an explicit and outward commitment by political leadership in many countries to be willing to cooperate together to require some type of protection against profit shifting, and that's really what Pillar 2 is all about. And you know, I sometimes get a little bit impatient when I hear countries protesting that Pillar 2 would be an infringement on sovereignty. Well, yeah, I mean anything that involves countries getting together to lessen tax competition is in some sense a limitation on sovereignty, but it's the only way to reduce the tax avoidance.
Thanks, Michael. Lynette said she had a comment. Do you want to make a comment, Lynette?
Yes. So let me put on my. So I'm from Barbados. So I'm from one of these countries that people consider to be a tax haven. And in the OECD guidelines, the most recent ones, I don't know if you have discussed this because I came in late, but I believe the extractive industries were excluded from the whole framework. Is that correct?
They were excluded in part. Yes, the thought was that it was hard to manipulate around a country that had extractive industries because of the location of the minerals or what have you, oil and gas itself.
You said it would be difficult to.
I think it was part.
I think the idea, which is mistaken, probably, is that the extractive sector is less vulnerable to tax competition because it's right. You have to stick with those. The investor has to remain in those relatively few countries that have deposits of the product in question.
Yes, I was actually wondering if that was a lobby from African countries. Because you were discussing the fact that African countries need to harmonize. So I was wondering if that was the case, but what you're saying is that it probably came about because they felt that they're less prone to tax competition.
Well,
I think it had to do with Pillar 1, not so much with Pillar 2, but go ahead, Michael.
No. I think, you know, and when these situations, when these decisions are made, it's very hard to tell whether empirically it's supportable that these industries are less susceptible to tax competition, or whether that's just a cover for a political argument that's being made by the industry. That's just the realities of international tax politics, that there are often many different reasons for doing something, and not everybody is totally transparent about their reasoning.
But I mean, clearly it's more politics than anything else.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's
the tax competition, etc.,
yeah,
where the OECD came down very hard on small countries, while there were states in USA doing exactly the same thing. You know, so it does make it seem that way, as though there is a very little law and really most of it is political expediency.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Just to clarify one point, extractive industries were not carved out of Pillar 2, but the minimum tax, so they would be included. In any event, everything's a matter of political will. There's an old saying, who gets what, when, and how, which is at the bottom of a lot of things. So it used to be, we used to look from the United States and say, oh, if you could just do it our way. But now that we look at the mess we've made of things, it's a little hard for us to say that anymore.
During the last century, there was a famous member of Congress in the United States, a tax legislator, and he gave his description of the politics of taxation in just a few lines. He said, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. And so, I mean, you know, there's nothing more political than tax, whether it's in the domestic or the international setting. And, you know, it's just reality. It's just human nature. I mean, and people are sometimes will mix when making arguments, will always mix their personal interest with their altruistic arguments. It's just, I mean, it's what makes the area so interesting and so essential, and also sometimes so tragic.
Yeah, let me turn it back to Makupa. I don't know whether you had any final comments. We've sort of gotten into a more general
No.
discussion here, but
Yeah, no, I think it just shows that indeed there's a lot of global reform happening at the moment. So discussions and debates are essential. And I think it's a great opportunity, speaking from a tax justice perspective and the African continent perspective, and perhaps nice to see that there's a great representation in the room for us to really look at this reform moment and get it right, so that those that have not benefited previously can start to benefit. And yeah, I think political will. We always say implementation. So we know what to do, we know what needs to be done, and how to do it. I think the onus really remains on political will and on us, the citizens, to put that pressure on our leaders and to choose the right leaders who will reflect our interests. So in a nutshell, I would say it's been an honor and a pleasure to interact, learn with everyone in this space, and yeah, looking forward to the coming days of the course.
thank you so much, Makupa. Let me just bring things to a close. We've, I guess, got a minute left or a couple of minutes left, but in any event, it's been a great discussion. I think I realize, and I hope you do, that a good part of this is the discussion that you folks bring to the table, both orally and then chat box. I'm sorry, go ahead. Did somebody have a comment? Oh. In any event, tomorrow Michael's going to address transfer pricing. I think today's conversation was great. I don't know whether you had any concluding comments or tidbits you wanted to offer about tomorrow, Michael, but we'll pick it up then, same time in the morning.
And nothing to add except thanks to everyone for this morning. This was very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great, everybody. Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll see you in the morning.